Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today, Rethinking Manufacturing Supply Chains Amid Coronavirus Disruption, presented by Biggins Lacey Shapiro and Company and Tractus Asia. One quick housekeeping note before we get started. If you'd like to ask a question during the webinar, please use the chat function on the toolbar. We will be hopefully getting to a few of those questions at the end. So if you have anything that pops into your mind during it, please go ahead and ask that in the chat box. My name is Michelle Comerford. I'm the Industrial and Supply Chain Practice Leader with Biggins Lacey Shapiro and Company. I am a professional site selection consultant that has been working with manufacturing and distribution clients for over 16 years now on their location strategy and site selection decisions. I have a background in supply chain and logistics, and so considering those aspects of site selection as well as labor markets, utilities, site aspects, other types of due diligence and incentives, all of those go into making good decisions for industrial sectors. I've worked across a wide variety of manufacturing industries throughout North America, including looking at strategically global footprints and comparing those alternatives. I'm joined today by my strategic colleague, Dennis Meseroll of Tractus Asia. Dennis, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Dennis Meseroll. I'm the co-founder and an executive director of the Tractus Asia. We have very complementary services to Biggins Lacey and Shapiro. We're helping primarily American industrial and manufacturing companies make good decisions about where to locate their investments in Asia. So our focus is on Asia, and then how to structure those investments in order to enter new markets. I'm originally from Princeton, New Jersey, but have called Asia my home for the last 29 years now. 25 of those years have been with Tractus. And we've worked very much like Biggins Lacey Shapiro with a wide variety of industrial and other service companies as well, helping them with their decisions about where they should be locating across many different sectors. So we hope to be able to share some of the experiences that we've gained over those 25 years, and also what we're seeing now in the current environment that we're in.
Great, thanks, Dennis. I think I speak for both of us that we're excited to discuss what we're each seeing during this global pandemic and talk about what we perhaps foresee coming out of it, particularly from a manufacturing standpoint. So safe to say the supply chain disruption as a result of coronavirus has been very well documented in the headlines. In fact, that's been kind of interesting buzzword, supply chain, that a lot of people are using, and see some examples here from a variety of different headlines. But it's been interesting because the disruption has occurred in a lot of different ways. On the supply side, as a lot of global operations had to shut down for a period of time, that impacted some companies' ability to get the parts and supplies, or in some cases their full products, imported to the country that they needed. That's very well illustrated in the U.S. by the shortages that we've seen of masks and ventilators and medical supplies and other kinds of essential equipment. But it's also been interesting on the upside to see a lot of great examples of U.S. manufacturers stepping up, retooling their production lines, being innovative to make these products and come up with solutions. So that's been actually a positive side of that disruption. On the demand side of that chain, we've also seen a lot of disruption as consumers' buying habits and priorities shifted basically overnight due to the stay-at-home orders. And we've seen that illustrated by the toilet paper shortages in the U.S. that have been well reported, as well as other kinds of household goods, home gym equipment, things that people really felt like they needed if they're going to be spending a long period of time at home. And manufacturers not having been prepared for that. So having to increase their production capabilities in a short period of time. Some of that is starting to even out as well in the U.S. But Dennis, have you seen that sort of thing in Asia?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of just how supply chains have evolved over time, and it's 30, 40 years of globalization have resulted in the concentration of supply chains in some industries that just haven't been very apparent to anybody, and the epidemic has made that really apparent in a few of them. And we've come to see that for some types of products, some types of services even, there's way too many eggs in too few baskets around the world. Some examples of that are, you've probably been reading some of these things in the press, but there's something called an active pharmaceutical ingredient, which is the actual chemical that makes up a drug. And is, for example, something like aspirin. 99% of the world's aspirin, the actual chemical, is produced in China. In antibiotics, for generic antibiotics, about 97% of generic antibiotics are made in China, 95% of the ibuprofen. But that's what makes the press. What you don't hear about is a place like India has about a 40% market share in the US for all types of generic drugs. And their supply source for the active pharmaceutical ingredients is in China. So we see that type of concentration. Probably the biggest headline now is the issue of trying to find personal protective equipment and masks in the United States to try to cope with the pandemic. Currently about 48% of personal protective equipment is being sourced in China, which is creating a big bottleneck. But that's not the only. China and Asia are not the only places where you have concentrations of manufacturing capabilities. Even at home in the United States, we've got a marquee brand of ours, Boeing, accounts for 50% of the world's commercial aviation or commercial aircraft. So if you're outside of North America or outside of Europe where Airbus is, they have the other half of the world's supply of aircraft. Those are highly concentrated as well. So we've got this concentration of production in locations with competitive advantages is something that's been there. We just haven't been aware of it.
Yeah, and Dennis, the idea of kind of how supply chains became this concentrated is not new. It's been kind of an ongoing process based on different industry sectors and different economic conditions. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right, and there's a lot of talk in the press now, right, Michelle, about reshoring, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. or restructuring supply chains. This has to be done because it's a major issue. But supply chains are constantly changing. If we go back in time, back in the 1980s, American companies were investing in what were called the Asian tiger economies: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. In the 90s, you had U.S. companies going to Japan to China as China opened up. The Japanese manufacturers of automotive vehicles started to set up transplant plants in the United States in the 90s. In the 2000s, you had most of the developed economies outsourcing services, call centers, and shared services into India. In the 2010s, we started to see regionalization. So from our perspective here in Asia, as we saw prices rise in China, we had some of our clients. One was a company called Rayovac, or the company that makes Rayovac batteries. And in 2010, it was becoming too expensive for them to manufacture their alkaline batteries in China. And we helped them to shut down the plant, restructure that business, and they moved the plant back to the United States. So the idea of reshoring has been going on sort of one-off for quite a while. The idea of restructuring a supply chain sort of out of China is not necessarily leaving the country completely. It's an enormous economy. One of our clients in the automotive component sector, had a very successful plant supplying both the China market and some other markets in Asia, but they maxed out the size of the plant, and we helped them with what's been called a China plus one strategy. Where should they go besides China? And we helped them look for a site location in where they ended up being. They ended up locating in northern Vietnam. That was the most cost-effective place for them to serve their markets within Asia outside of China. So this kind of supply chain restructuring has been going on for quite some time.
Yeah, and just to note from the BLS side, we've been working with a number of clients, particularly over the last 7-8 years, on reshoring, or in some cases, first time into the U.S. Decision making. So part of that sort of reshoring trend that's already started to happen in the 2010s, due to companies wanting to get closer to the markets where their products will be consumed. And so we've seen that pendulum start to swing for some types of industries and some types of companies leading up to this point. But of course, now we have the disruption that is causing a lot of waves. But we should mention that disruptions of supply chain are not a new thing. There's been a number over the past even just 10 years. Dennis, you want to talk about a couple in Asia?
Yeah, one of the kind of the marquee ones that started the issue of being concerned about and taking more evaluation of risk in location decisions was the Fukushima, kind of the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear disaster. That shut down a few plants in a very small region of Japan that impacted a few companies around the world, but they were very strategic suppliers. And so they kind of died out in terms of a marquee question that was on people's minds. Later that year in 2011, there was a major flooding in Thailand, and that shut down 50% of the world's hard disk drive manufacturing capability. So that had knock-on ramifications, not only for hard disk drives, but all the personal computer industry. And so the electronics manufacturers started to really take that into consideration and say, well, we can't concentrate so much of our production in one location. And then we almost don't hear it anymore because everything is the pandemic. But the next big impact or risk issue was the U.S.-China trade war. That impacted all the trade between the United States and China. Our phones were ringing off the hook as companies needed to move at least some of their production outside of China in order to avoid the tariffs. They had to find another place to locate. And, COVID, of course, instead of impacting a piece of the global economy, just the US or just the hard disk drive industry, COVID's affecting everything. We're all being hit by it.
Yeah, that's for certain. And it is interesting how the headline shift, the China trade war was all that the headlines were talking about up until just a month or two ago at this point. So it's interesting how quickly and how widespread, this has really impacted so many different industries and people. And I know now in the U.S., the economy is still, we're in the midst of a lot of closures and still stay-at-home orders, a lot of uncertainty about when and how to get back to work. And President Trump just announced today a new task force with a number of business leaders on it to start to look at this issue and make a plan. But a lot of people are wondering, what is normalcy, look like? Dennis, knowing that Asia's a couple months ahead of this curve, I believe, can you give us a little bit of insight about what's happening there in regards to these kinds of closures?
Yeah, sure. I hope to give a little bit of hope that there's light at the end of the tunnel with the pandemic. The things that we're seeing now from countries that took it very seriously, locked down very quickly, monitored and tested the population. Places like Korea were really, their manufacturing was shut down for only about 2 weeks. They'd been back up, and that was in parallel with the manufacturing shutdown in China. So that was a supply chain knock-on impact. But they've been up and running pretty much since early March. And they're implementing industrial social distancing, as it were, and infection control procedures. Same thing with China. Again, there were some issues in the beginning about them controlling the outbreak, but once it became very apparent that it was extremely serious, they literally locked down the entire economy for a period of weeks, which allowed them to control control the epidemic. And they're now our office in Shanghai is the only office that's kind of back to normal. All of our other Asian offices are on work from home. Everyone's still practicing social distancing and wearing masks, but things are much more back to normal in China and Korea. Places like Taiwan, Thailand is still, and manufacturing is depending on the sector, depending on the demand, up about maybe 80% of production. So there's light at the end of the tunnel, Michelle.
Well, that's some good positive news to hear. Everyone's sort of wondering what the new normal might look like in manufacturing. What's happening in Asia plants?
Yeah, so the companies that are up and running, it's not really normal. So some of our clients that are in electronics and those types of industries where typically the plant is more like it's very clean and everyone has gowns on and masks on, they're pretty much at full production because they have good infection control anyway. Some other clients of ours that are in the garment industry, for example, they took the closed plants down for a few weeks, took that time to retool their manufacturing floor to space out, in the garment industry, space out the sewing machines so that there was a meter or 2 meters in between each one. And then they have all sorts of disinfection controls. They're taking temperatures. They're segregating people's parking lots and where they park their motorcycles, and in the canteen where they eat. They're also talking about the future, the very near future, as testing technologies change. The manufacturing companies that we've been talking to they're waiting for a very rapid and very inexpensive test kit so that they can test 100% of their workers. And there's a pretty good chance that in a very short period of time, we're seeing these rapid test kits come out. And there's a pretty good chance that as they ramp that production up into the billions of tests, it'll become so inexpensive that you can do this twice daily testing. So the manufacturers are talking about pre-shift testing, segregating anybody that tests positive, and then post-shift testing, again, to segregate people that test positive, and also to then sequester the work teams that are working near and around the infected person. And then longer term, maybe a better treatment or vaccine, but that's in the future.
Right. Yeah. I know in the U.S., some of the manufacturing plants that have stayed open have been practicing and implementing social distancing. But I think you're right. I think the same here for the testing, really having that access to frequent testing is part of the path to getting people comfortable to get up and running again. It's certainly going to, cause people to think more about risk factors, companies and employees. And I think we'll see companies start to look to automate even more to help guard against those future risk factors. Kind of on that note, I think, going forward, this is going to cause a lot of manufacturers to rethink their footprints overall. I talked earlier about the trend that's already started about reshoring or getting production closer to the markets where products will be consumed. There's a lot of benefit to doing that. You can get products faster to market. You can react quicker to changes in preferences. And just, as consumers, we have an expectation to get our stuff faster. And so you can serve those markets much, much faster when you're closer to them. So I think given the additional disruptions and risks that this has shed light on, I think we'll see more companies consider what we call a local for local model. So creating production capabilities in those markets where those products are destined for. And so that in some cases doesn't mean totally pulling out of China or Asia. They would, maintain a presence there to serve that market, but perhaps moving some of that production to the U.S. for products that were destined for the U.S. And I think we'll see a lot more of that happening. Part of that equation has been looking at the total cost of ownership, which is looking at not only the pure manufacturing cost or even the pure landed cost, but also including some of those risk factors in there that can be really hard to quantify, but coming up with a mechanism or applying some scenarios to what if we can't get our product to market within 6 weeks or whatever it is. So looking at those scenarios and not just a pure cost will be factors going forward. And another major reason that a lot of these strategies have been able to be considered up to this point and will be going forward is the advances in manufacturing technology that we have been making, particularly over the last 10 years. There has been certainly an acceleration in things in 3D printing, more robotics, more automated lines. And we're actually seeing a lot of that come into play right now with current U.S. manufacturers retooling their lines. And when they have 3D printing capabilities, a lot of those are the companies that have been able to churn out these face masks and things that we've been in such shortage of in the U.S. And so an increase in that technology going forward will also help to accelerate some of these new decisions. When companies are starting to think about making products in the U.S., again, that are destined for the U.S., there are, of course, as anything, some challenges and some opportunities. Labor costs are certainly going to be higher than in some of the offshore locations. A lot of those operations that went into Asia, went into China 30 years ago, were chasing that low-cost manual labor because that's what their operation required. But again, with more of the automation, there's a less reliance on overall labor, so less people overall required. Prior to the crisis, there was a major skilled labor shortage in the U.S. And arguably, even with the unemployment right now at record highs, there could still be a skills gap challenge coming out of this. Many of the unemployed folks right now are unemployed either because their shops temporarily closed down. So in theory, if those, when those start up again, they will have a job again. And so we'll still be kind of looking at getting more skilled workers into the workforce. And another challenge is that pre-crisis, again, there was a limited inventory of available existing manufacturing buildings. So the idea of being able to get into a building, get up and running quickly was challenging pre-crisis. And definitely will be going forward. On the opportunity side, pre-crisis, there were a lot of underemployed workers, so people that were looking for new opportunities. There's been a lot of focus on workforce training and upskilling to help close that skills gap and get more skilled workers in the market. There's been a focus on getting sites shovel ready and prepped for investment, so that should shave off some time and cost for new capital investment. There have been a number of incentives that have been developed by states and local communities to help promote and support capital investment and job creation. And there's a benefit for particularly consumer products of having a Made in the USA label. Some consumers that really look for that and are willing to pay a little bit more, in fact, for that label as well. So Dennis, a lot of the other headlines right now are talking about companies heading for the exit from Asia in mass numbers. What do you think about that?
Well, exit's a pretty absolute word, right, Michelle? But it kind of depends, right? There's some enticements. So I think everybody's read the press that the Japanese government's allocated $2.2 billion to help Japanese companies exit China specifically. Some of that 2.2 billion is some of it is for most of it is to bring them back into Japan, but some of it's also being allocated for them to find other locations outside of China, maybe in Southeast Asia, that they can operate. And of course, not to be outdone, Larry Kudlow recently announced that maybe the United States should also pay the moving costs of every company that wants wants out of China to get them to come back to the United States. So some companies, this may be because of the risk factors, because of the issues with the U.S.-China trade war, that makes sense for them. And particularly if there's some type of incentive enticement to do that. But some companies, they're not going to exit Asia 100%. Companies will move where it makes sense for them to locate, and then in many cases that may be they may need to be in a low-cost location, low-cost labor cost location. So places in Southeast Asia or India may make more sense for them. Companies won't leave wholesale from China, but they may restructure their operations. There was a survey done by the American Chamber of Commerce in China, and the most profitable companies, the most profitable American companies in China are the ones that serve the local market and don't do any exporting. The companies that are there doing 100% exporting were the least profitable. They were profitable, but they made the least amount. And those decisions about where to go, should you leave, should you stay or should you go, and where should you go, are not only based on costs. They're not only based on these risk decisions, the risk issues. They're based on a number of different factors, and those need to be considered, and they will. Companies will definitely start to do that. So that's something we're absolutely seeing. In the past, as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, this is an ongoing process of looking at what your supply chains should look like. Companies would do that onesie twosies throughout the year, but in this case, everyone, it's on the agenda at almost every board meeting. What do we need to do to make our supply chains more resilient? And we're definitely seeing that happening. That's certainly a trend across the globe. But with that, globalization is not dead. Companies, no matter where they're from, they're not going to necessarily move back only to their home country. They're going to be going where it makes sense for their business to be successful. That could be, they may need to be close to their market. And we're seeing that distributed supply chain, distributed manufacturing throughout the world to be close to your market. It's in some cases, the labor cost or some aspect of the cost may be higher, but because your supply chain is shorter and your inventories are shorter and your inventory on the water that's being traded globally is shorter, it makes the cost less. We're unlikely to see, like the example I gave with Rayovac, there's going to be some of it, but completely shutting down one plant in one market and moving back to a home market or moving to another market. You're going to see some combination of the two. And we're also starting to see now, and it's been a trend that's probably started the last 3 or 4 years, much more, and Michelle touched on it before, an increase in automation, the use of artificial intelligence, particularly in the service industry, things like even call centers and share service centers in places like Manila in the Philippines and India. Those companies are, as labor costs rise, as it becomes more difficult to find qualified staff, they're using technology to make themselves more efficient. So you don't necessarily need to move. But again, there's going to be definitely going to be a major boardroom topic. There's going to be a lot of companies looking at where they need to be, and there's lots of opportunities. I know we have a lot of economic developers in the audience tonight. There's a lot of opportunities for U.S. economic developers to position themselves for taking advantage of companies that are rethinking where they should locate.
Absolutely, Dennis. I agree with those points. So for the companies joining us today, I'm sure many of your firms are asking some of these questions now internally in your boardrooms. And now is the time to start planning and strategizing for what's next. What impacts have you been experiencing? What sensitivities has the crisis exposed? And what are your options for making adjustments in the future to be better prepared? For some of the communities and economic developers I know we have in the audience. Are you prepared? Are you prepared for new investment? Do you have enough skilled workers? Are you focused on what the next generation of manufacturing plants need? Is everyone prepared to withstand the next disruption that is inevitable on the horizon? So, this is what our firms do. We can help you consider these location strategy options, and then also move forward with those, not just from the strategy, but actually the identification of specific location, the right community, the right site. We work closely with economic development groups at the state and local levels as part of that process, and consider all the different variables from transportation down to local labor markets, as well as those incentive support programs that may be applicable to your investment. So with that, Dennis, I think we did pretty good on our time. I think we can take a few questions. I'm going to pull these up. I see a few questions have been asked in the chat box. Thank you for submitting those. If we don't get a chance to, Dennis, can you see those questions?
Actually, no. I think it must be just you. So you can read them out. That would be good.
Okay. If we don't get a chance to get to your question, or if you have one you didn't want to submit, please feel free to reach out to Dennis or I directly, or both of us. You'll see there our contact information, our email addresses, our company websites, as well as our LinkedIn profiles. So feel free to reach out to me, I know, on any of those, from any of those avenues, and same with Dennis. So let me pull up a, okay, is China back to running normal? I think we hit on that, Dennis.
Yeah, about as well. Let's call it the new normal, because people are still walking around. Everyone has masks on. That's a requirement. Everyone has a tracking app on their phone, so that if there are outbreaks in certain areas, the government can inform you to go get tested. And people are being cautious, and those things are a little slower than they used to be. But that's the light. That's where we see the light at the end of the tunnel. So that's great, and that's going to be happening in other locations as well.
That's interesting, Dennis. I know in the U.S. that's the app capability is one thing that's being tossed around, and there's kind of some pushback. I don't know if we'll see that or not here.
They have them in Korea too, and they only require people that are positive or that are quarantined to have the app. But the Koreans, like the society, they're taking this very seriously, because there are some countries in Asia that they've experienced this a sort of mini pandemic already, with SARS back in 2002, and then MERS, which came out of the Middle East. They were already impacted. We were fortunate in America and in Europe that never got that far, but they've experienced this already. So everyone's very cautious. It's good to have practice. Right.
Sorry, I'm reading some of these questions. I think we hit on some of these. COVID has exposed many economic vulnerabilities, but do you feel the non-economic factors that have been discovered about China play into decision-making on where to base manufacturing or move manufacturing going forward?
The answer to that is absolutely, and it's actually always on our clients' minds. So we've had just in almost every project where there is a large, let's call it an intellectual property component. That's a consideration. So worked on a financial services company, major global financial services company that wanted to manage their global network out of a central location. They had one location in North America, and they wanted to have one in Asia, just so they could have 24-hour service. And because managing the company's network would open it up to, if there was a breach, would open it up to accessing all of their financial information and all of their customers' financial information, China was just knocked off the search area. They wouldn't even consider it. And we've had other clients with very with high intellectual property rights content to their products and or services that wouldn't consider locating there, or if they do consider those types of risks, for sure.
Okay. Dennis, what are some of the other countries that might be considered instead of China in Asia for that low cost? What are some of those up and coming countries that you're seeing activity for clients?
Yeah, similar to the example I gave with the China plus one, and also the locations that, say, a lot of Japanese companies kind of prioritize in Southeast Asia. And it really depends on the kind of manufacturing that's going on. If it's a little more labor intensive, Vietnam is the flavor of the kind of the flavor of the decade. Low cost labor. It's a large country, good kind of very productive labor force, large population, so a large labor force, lots of free trade agreements. They're actually a part of what used to be the TPP, so the mini TPP. They've got a lot of free trade agreements. Places like in Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, if it's food processing, those are very large agricultural countries. We've had companies also looking at India, enormous population. Mm-hmm. It's starting to become a manufacturing destination. It's on companies' radar screens now.
Great. I see a couple questions about Mexico, and I would be remiss if I did not mention that certainly for some companies that are looking at the nearshoring model. So again, just getting production at least closer to the in the North American market, closer to the mass U.S. customer market. Mexico has been already on the radar for a lot of those companies, and will continue to be. There have been some changes now, especially with the USMCA in place, that gives companies some more certainty. There have been some changes made as a result of that agreement. And certainly there are some other types of risk factors that will come into play for operations locating there. But certainly I think we'll see some of that shifting investment move to Mexico for the North American market.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Michelle. I didn't touch on it, but companies in Asia, there's one we're working with right now, is thinking of moving part of their production, electronics for the automotive industry. It's destined for the U.S. They're only considering Mexico, and then they would restructure their operations. They happen to be in China. They'd restructure those operations just for the Asian market. And we've done some supply chain financial feasibility analysis between China, India, Eastern Europe, and Mexico, and the winner turned out to be a client was manufacturing their power tool product in China, but when we did the analysis across all those different markets, Mexico was the exact same cost, and this was about 6 or 7 years ago. It was just as cost effective for them to be in Mexico as it was for to be in China. It also gave them the ability to react to customer demand much faster, because they could get a new product out the door quickly and then to the U.S. market in 2 days, essentially, from a plant in Mexico. So Mexico is going to be, we see that. We certainly, even though we're focused here on Asia, it's on everybody's mind here as well as a potential location.
Yep, and I think a lot of it will depend on the specific operation. Arguably, some of the more skilled operations are going to look at the U.S. or look at Europe. Mm-hmm. I know, Dennis, we have a current biotechnology project that essentially initially considering the global market, but as quickly kind of screened down to the different markets in the U.S. and Europe due to the specific type of skills that they're seeking. And so I think we'll see some of that also occur as we move forward for really high-skilled operations to be seeking that labor, in those markets. It doesn't exist everywhere. And so that will be another component to these decisions. Well, Dennis, with that, would you have any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with?
Well, I think maybe we just want to. I think we covered pretty much every topic we wanted to on this one, Michelle. So why don't we want to thank everybody for. We hope you found this interesting. We hope it was maybe gave you some hope a little bit because it was focused on the COVID pandemic. That there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and that the fact that companies are now almost every company is reevaluating their supply chains now. For the economic developers in the audience, it's a great opportunity for you to position yourself and get ready to potentially receive some of those investments, either expansions of the companies that are already in your location or potentially new investment coming from other US companies or coming from other countries.
Absolutely. Now's the time to focus on or continuing or increasing your workforce training. I think that the skilled labor component, as you think about more automated equipment and manufacturing plants that are going to be required in these new investments, is critical. So now's the time to keep pushing that ball forward, and in the U.S. in particular. So thank you all for joining us. You will get, as a result from registering for this, you'll receive a link of the recording. Feel free to share that with your colleagues. Again, if you have any other questions or want to reach out and talk more, please feel free to contact Dennis or myself. Have a great day. Thank you very much, everybody. Everyone. Stay safe and healthy. Thank you.
Good night from Bangkok.
Thanks, Dennis.